Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we are very pleased to be hosting Emily Kasriel, who's here to talk about her new book, Deep Listening: Transform Your Relationships with Family, Friends, and Foes. Now, Emily's spent more than 2 decades with the BBC, including roles as a radio journalist, editor, and media executive. About a dozen years ago, sort of on the side, she began training as an executive coach and later also became a workplace mediator. And at the BBC, she began focusing on stories that involve the bridging of divisions and solving conflicts, and advised colleagues on how to foster conversations that brings people together. This led her to do further research across a number of fields: psychology, neuroscience, peace building, management thinking, medicine, teaching, and philosophy, just to name a few. And eventually, she developed her own approach to improve listening, which is presented in her book. The book's starting point is the idea that really many of us are pretty poor listeners. We take listening for granted, Emily contends, and instead, in conversations, we fixate on trying to explain ourselves. And yet, as Emily asserts, listening is a critically important skill and has a lot to do with how well we relate to one another and how well societies function. So Emily provides us practical guidance on how to listen better, even or especially when we fiercely disagree, which of course is happening all too often these days in this era of such political polarization. At the heart of Emily's approach is something dubbed deep listening, which for her is this 8-step framework. The steps are intended to take us from what Emily calls the standard or transactional style of listening to a style that's transformational, which Emily describes as a more engaging, more empathetic, more respectful way of listening. So some of the steps include cultivating genuine curiosity toward whoever's speaking, using silence to give the speaker space to think, and reflecting back on what the speaker has conveyed. And listening in this way, Emily says, will lead to better understanding, deeper connections, and more productive interactions, all of which seems to me at least makes Emily eminently worth listening to, and her book certainly worth reading. In conversation with Emily will be Christopher Turpin, who spent nearly 2.5 decades at NPR, first producing All Things Considered, then in various executive positions involving programming operations, news, and special projects. And then for 4 years, from 2020 until the end of last year, he served as Chief of Staff to NPR's President and CEO. So please join me in welcoming Emily Kasriel and Christopher Turpin.
Thanks, Brad. Hello, everyone. Well, let's get started. Emily, welcome to DC, a city, as Brad says, that's probably in need of a little deep listening expertise at this moment in time. I wanted to start by asking you, you say in your book that we have a crisis of listening, and I'm interested in what you mean by a crisis of listening.
I think it's because the way we so often listen, we perform listening. We go through the motions. But what we're actually doing is preloading our verbal gun with ammunition ready to fire. We listen long enough to interrupt the person and help them complete their sentence, or to tell them what really are the facts that they should know about. Or we listen long enough to get the very essential facts, sometimes only a few seconds, before we solve their problem for them. Because after all, that's why they share stuff with us. That's why they tell us. And in doing so, we leave people feeling dismissed, used, and certainly unheard.
You did a study, right? You did a survey for your book, which I think was really, really interesting, and it showed a lot of things. There's one of the things that amazed me was that most people have this sort of nostalgia that somehow we used to listen better. We used to somehow sit around the dinner table, or actually talk to each other, or get our ear trumpets out and really kind of zero in on what everyone is saying. And can you talk a little bit more about what you actually found when you went out and talked to people about listening and how they felt about it?
Well, that survey was actually done by YouGov and More in Common, so that was a poll, so that didn't involve talking to people, but that did find that you're quite right, that people believed that in the US, I think it was 2 in 3 people believed that people used to be better at listening. Now, people say a lot about how things used to be better. It doesn't necessarily mean it is. It just means their perception. But what we found is that especially people online did not feel heard. And we also discovered when we asked them why, would you like to learn to listen better? And in the US, I think it was 2 in 3 said yes. And we said, what would motivate you? Would it be to listen better to your family, to do better at work, to listen to people who think differently, to get on better with friends, to be more comfortable with silence? What do you think was the most popular answer, both in the US and in the UK? Any guesses? Any thoughts? Work, somebody said. What else might be? Friends. Any other thoughts? Family. Go on. Friends and acquaintances. It was actually getting better at listening to people who you disagree with. So that was great. And that enabled me to tell the publishers we needed to include the word foes in the answer, because there's a thirst to be able to have these kind of conversations. There's a desire for a lot of people to do so, but they just don't know how.
We'll get to the notion of what deep listening is in your conception in just a minute, but I wanted to sort of focus for a second on your journey and how you got interested in this as a subject. You were a reporter for a long time. You worked in a lot of countries in Africa. You worked in Japan, India, lots of different places. And there was one anecdote in Africa that really caught my attention when I was reading the book, that really seemed to sort of propel you on this journey.
Yeah, it was when I had just started at BBC Africa, and I was in Johannesburg, and we heard that a story was unfolding in Pretoria, which is one of the seats of government in South Africa. And it's an hour away, so we bundled into the BBC van, turned up, and there were a lot of soldiers. These were former Mkontwe Wesizwe army people. They were the ANC guerrilla army, but they had since just recently been incorporated into the white South African Defence Force, which used to be the army of the apartheid South African government of the state. And these guys were angry. They felt that they had substandard food, housing, their rank had been demoted, but most of all, they felt it was humiliating to be bossed around by these former enemies, now who were their, sergeants in charge, telling them what to do. And they wanted to speak to their leader. They wanted to speak to Nelson Mandela. So I spent probably more than an hour wandering around, listening to the soldiers and understanding about their frustrations. And everybody was waiting for Nelson Mandela. And eventually we looked up in the air and there was the rotating blades of the presidential helicopter. So we went to this hastily erected podium to see what Nelson Mandela would say. But he wasn't there. And instead, I found him wandering amongst the soldiers. And he came up to one guy and he said, so, tell me your name. Yeah. And where do you live? And the guy told him. So Alexandra Township, but what street? And where along that street? And now tell me, why are you here? I want to know. And he consistently did this all across the crowd for over an hour. Excuse me, before he got up onto the podium and he said, I have heard you. I understand your grievances, but now you need to be disciplined. You need to go back to your barracks and you need to help build the new South Africa. And the soldiers listened and they went back to their barracks. And it was a really beautiful example of someone in power, because most often people in power don't listen. But Mandela, President Nelson Mandela, did listen to the people before he spoke. And he listened with curiosity and respect, and they felt it.
So turning to sort of the practicalities of this then, how do you, when you started thinking about deep listening, how did you come to define it? How would you define it as being different from what we regularly do, or maybe even what we're doing now?
I think when you deep listen, it's like the whole of you listens to the whole of them with empathy and respect, as Brad was saying. And it's not for every conversation. It would be kind of weird if I said, would you like a cup of tea? And you went,
I could sit there silently for like 15 seconds.
Exactly. Exactly. And I would probably throw the tea in your face or vice versa. It would be pretty weird, huh? Deep listening is for the conversations that really matter. When we feel we have a relationship that needs bridging, or when we feel differently, or we're talking to somebody from a very different background or a different perspective.
And so what are the keys? In your book, you outline 8 separate steps, I think it is, that are the keys to deep listening. And it's not, I don't think you have to exercise all of them at any one time, do you? But it's interesting. You have a very defined sort of process and set of things for people to think about.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So the first one is create the space. So here, if we were trying to have a deep listening encounter, pretty hard. We're being looked at by 30 people who are, it's not a private space. It's not a space where we can authentically really discover what we are thinking. So it's finding a place of safety. So if you're in an open plan office, for example, and you want to find out why a colleague's got issues with their timekeeping, probably not the best place, even if there's a glass screen and can't be heard, because nobody's going to feel comfortable to authentically tell you what's really going on. Overhead blue-white lights, like in this room, make us perhaps buy books very quickly, or in a hospital or school, don't make us feel the most relaxed. So warm lights are great, side lights are great. They can make us feel more comfortable. And a lot of wood, which we've got in this space, is great. Materials good, not so good glass and metal, especially if people are a bit older and they struggle to hear. And even more, can we think of a place where that individual might feel really cherished? So I spent time in Japan with Japanese tea ceremony practitioners, and they've evolved the whole tea ceremony so they'll actually rotate the vessel around so that the most beautiful image is facing their guest. They put a special bamboo leaf from the garden and even choose a most delicate sweet treat of that very season, and I think they have 72 seasons. So maybe your favorite Adele track that your partner loves before you broach a difficult conversation with them. So step 2 is about listening to yourself first. You can't really be in a place to listen to someone else until you know what's going on with your stuff. And it may be an unacknowledged agenda, like, I've got to prove my brother wrong. It might be that person represents to you and reminds you of your bullying older brother. So you're not listening to them. You're listening to that bullying older brother. And again, you are feeling like you were 5. How well can you listen to them when you're feeling like that? So taking the time to do that thinking, and actually in the book, I've done a picture of all these ladies trying to listen, but all these crazy shadows are kind of causing havoc inside her, and she's desperately trying to listen. But because she hasn't heard those shadows first, she's not in a place to do so. And I would say that if you've experienced trauma, this type of listening to yourself, it's not easy. It's a journey of a lifetime. So you might need some professional help. And even if you haven't experienced trauma, thinking of a safe anchor, something to return to that makes you feel comfortable, like a favorite pet or your mum or a place of nature, can be great to keep in your mind to help you return to being present. And step 3 is being present. So when I do workshops, which I've done around the world and in conflict zones and boardrooms, I do a bit of meditation. My husband said, please don't do that today. So you'll be relieved to know we're not going to do any, quiet presence, but it is about being in a state of presence. Surprise, surprise, our phones, even if they're off, and completely blank, they will still distract us. So best out of sight. And it's also the internal distractions. You've got to run home and finish this conversation, get home in time to watch the game or pick up your kids from school. Being aware of what's going on, returning to a place of presence. So before I do a coaching session, I might spend, 5 minutes just getting into presence so I'm ready and open to listening. And you talk both about curiosity and that it's so important, because step 4 is called, be curious, because we so often assume we already know what the person is going to say. Our friend who's telling us yet again about their difficult boss, so we don't listen. But actually, we're all in the process of becoming. We're not the person that we were last year, last week, or even last night. So imagine if you approach an encounter not knowing what your partner or your child or your colleague is saying, as if you listen for the first time and see what new things you can discover. And it will allow them to have perhaps new thoughts. And from that curiosity can come empathy and even respect, because suddenly you understand more about that person. They're not just a label, an ideology, a relationship. They become a human being, and you're listening human to human. And step 5 is about the gaze. Actually, face to face, not brilliant, yeah? Because either you're about to fight or kiss, which is not always appropriate. 60 degrees is far better. Here we are. We're not, we're slightly, but if we moved our chairs a little, we could be 60 degrees. That's really ideal. But maybe it's about going for a walk. But there's so much research around the gaze, so that if I'm listening to you, you might go on a journey and start looking up, top right. But because I'm continuing to hold the gaze, and of course that's not a kind of Michel Foucault penetrative gaze like a prison officer might do for a prisoner, it's a warm, empathetic, inviting gaze, which will allow you to feel safe. And people, unless it's a First Nation or somebody's on the spectrum, there are certain people it doesn't work. And actually also, in terms of body language, you might be really smiling, your body language, but that's because you're about to snag the last donut on the plate, not because of anything I've said. Not so reliable. Tone of voice, very reliable when we're trying to understand what the person really feels. And step 6, and you mentioned silence. Now, again, a lot of us feel, we don't like an awkward silence. It makes us feel uncomfortable. And yet, when I encourage people to practice some silence after the person has spoken, people tell me afterwards, like when they get back to them a few months after they've done this deep listening work with me, they say it has made the most transformational difference to their lives, because silence allows us to calm down, blood pressure goes down, heart rate goes down, and allows us to enter a space of trust. Even in negotiations, there was a paper that came out in 2021, Silence is Golden, when both parties were invited to be silent. They came out with many more win-win solutions, creative ones, where both parties benefited, rather than zero sum. If I win, you lose. Step 7 is about reflecting back. Now, has anybody been on an active listening course? Yeah, one person here, a few couple of people. Well, that's what you kind of learn. Yeah, I reflect back, I get the message. So what you're saying is this. Yeah, I get it. That is performative. When you reflect back with deep listening, you really are using not just your intellectual mind, but your intuition to hazard a guess about not just the words, but the notes between the words and their emotions. And you offer this back with humility. So I'm sensing that you say, yeah, and you then say, not quite, or yes, and not this, but that. And in doing so, you understand yourself more clearly, I understand you, and we feel more connected.
It's an iterative process of trying to work out what the other person is really thinking and feeling.
Exactly, and not in a sort of like probing way to get to the bottom of their story, but just that, so you both understand more clearly. And then it's the step 8 is about going deeper to understand their deeper narrative, including their deepest hopes, their motivation and their needs. And that enables you to understand them at a very different level.
It's interesting because you tell a very good story on yourself in the book about when you were interviewing, I think it's the president of Ethiopia, right? And where you felt that you failed as an interviewer. And I thought that was very interesting because it gets to one of the big kind of ethical conundrums, right? That if you're really being open to listening to people, it can sometimes feel as if you're validating them and agreeing with them, even when they might be doing and saying things that you find reprehensible. And I wonder how you think about that in the concept of deep listening.
Yeah, that is such an important question because that's what really stops people from listening. And I used to be like that as well. I mean, I used to think that if there were people who had abhorrent beliefs, it was best to avoid them. And if I did have to engage, it was better to cut them off as soon as I could. Because if I gave the daylight to their thoughts, this would be dangerous and they could contaminate me in some way. And it would indicate that I agreed. What's really exciting about deep listening, and I find when I'm working with people, that they get that listening does not signal agreement. Because at no stage, and we'll maybe do a little demo in a second, do you actually say, so, that is an orange book. You believe that book is orange. Or not even you believe, that book is orange. You're just saying, so I'm understanding that you say that the book is orange. You do not endorse them. And what we did in the research poll that we conducted with YouGov and More in Common, that young people, Gen Z, were much more likely to think that listening signaled agreement, which is why they don't listen. And other people are fearful. I was just doing a workshop today with an NGO, and it was in someone's home. And on the fridge, it was like instructions for their children. They have 5 children. One of them was always listen. But what they actually meant was always obey. And that's when we're kids, we learn listening is, listen to me, your teacher says, meaning shut up, put your pens in your pencil case, And that's why a lot of us fear listening, because we think we'll need to do what the other person has instructed, has said, but we don't. We have freedom to make our own choice, and we have freedom to challenge them, because listening doesn't mean you never get your chance to ask questions or to give your perspective. It's just about taking that time first, ideally, to really understand them. And it's more powerful if you have more power than them, like Nelson Mandela, because he subverted the traditional power dynamic.
Can you talk a little bit about point 8, which is about going deeper, and what you mean by going deeper? Because I think also that gets to going beyond the kind of superficial listening. What do you mean by that, and what kind of work do you have to put into that?
I think it is, not something you can do very quickly. And let me give you an example. I was at the BBC, while I was there, I wanted to talk to some dairy farmers who didn't believe in climate change. I wanted to find some, and I wanted purposely to use deep listening. Now, I, like, almost 100% of scientists, believe that climate change is a thing and that human activity has caused, incredible increase in our global temperature. And I went to see this guy, and he was just on the border between England and Wales, and he had a long tradition of dairy farming. His father and his grandfather before him had farmed the cattle of herd that in the family. There were even generational cows with these names, Estelle, Mabel, that had continued for generations. And I wanted to understand, how could somebody who was so much part of the environment, who was up at 4 a.m. every day milking the cows and seeing the landscape and seeing the changes in the landscape. And he was adamant that this was just another cycle that the earth naturally goes in. And I remember, and I write about in the book, that I spent a couple of days with him. And on the morning of the second day, I just went into the fields and was like, what's going on here? And then I was thinking that he was, had a lot of grievance. He was kind of almost bitter for all of the impositions that he saw that central government in the UK were imposing on farmers. Low milk prices. There was tuberculosis. He had to kill some of his cows. There was mad cow disease. There were all of these sort of prohibitions and diseases and rules that they had to do. And he perceived climate change to be another one of these central government missives which was sent down to destroy farmers like him. And when I reflected in this article, which was published by the BBC, a digital piece, about his deeper narrative, I also placed it in the context of a lot of climate science about the contribution of dairy farmers, which is pretty significant to global warming. And yet, he really felt heard. He was really pleased with the piece because I had taken the time to understand what it felt like to be him. And then I phoned him up. We were in the car. And I phoned him up and said, I want to include this story in my book. Is that okay with you? Because I felt this was another step and I needed to get his agreement. And he said to me, I want you to come to my farm and start your second book on deep listening on my farm.
Did you at any point tell him that you disagreed with him and that you thought he was wrong and that the science showed that he was wrong?
After really listening, he knew where I stood on the science. Yeah, he did. It's not that I kept that private. I explained my beliefs and the science that validated that. But my key role there was to understand him. So I wasn't trying to convince him.
So just to try and draw him out and to make sure that you had understood what his underlying motivations were.
And what's so exciting is that there'll be something most likely that will have changed in him by being heard. Because there's some research, quite a lot of research that demonstrates that when people feel truly heard, they dial down their attitude extremity, which means they feel, less strongly about their beliefs because they feel less defensive. There's no need to defend them if they're being truly heard. And I did a big project. So in 2022, we recruited 1,000 people in 100 countries. I trained in deep listening over 3 weeks. And I thought, hey, I'm not doing something at this scale without actually seeing if it works. So I reached out to some academics at the University of Haifa and the University of Reading who are real experts in listening. And they set up a control group and compared the experience of a control group who had a conversation about a really contentious topic with the people who had been trained over 3 weeks and had a similar conversation about contentious topic. And the research, which has just been published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology, your bedtime reading not, yeah?
But it sounds really important.
But it's not the best read. But they found that when people practice deep listening, even as they discussed these contentious topics, they felt more connected, they felt safer to express themselves and more understood. And then, this is the really exciting bit, they felt more open to re-examine their own attitudes. So, my sense is that when that farmer felt truly heard, he would be able to, and actually I didn't ask him, and maybe I should have done, whether through the process he felt differently, but certainly all sorts of people who I have talked to in other contexts, the fact that I'm not trying to, just interrogate them, but instead be open to them means that they feel really heard. And then they might say, oh, well, maybe there are other perspectives, or maybe two perspectives are possible. But this isn't about compromising your beliefs. It's about more understanding. And more understanding on climate change, for example, it's so important that we can, really work with a whole different types of constituents in order to tackle what is, as we're experiencing in DC and in London and in Europe this week, such a huge crisis in our world.
So you've talked the talk here, you've talked us through the 8 steps, so now let's see you walk the walk. Let's try a little demonstration of this. Do we have a willing volunteer anywhere in the audience? Not me, who would like to...
Shall I tell you what question you're going to answer? Wait, before you volunteer, let me have the question, which is, I'm going to ask you, what food reminds you of home? So if anybody wants to and I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and everybody is not going to judge the person talking about the food. They're going to be looking at me and just, I'll probably get some things wrong. That's okay. You're going to give me some feedback on how well I've been able to practice some of these steps. We can't do all of them. We can't change the overhead lighting here, yeah? But how much have I been able to do? So anybody like to volunteer? I will get Chris.
I think there was a keen volunteer over here. So
you'd like
come and take a seat.
Take the seat here. So.
And I'm going to stand off to the side for a second.
Okay.
Great. Do you want to put the microphone so it's nearer you? And I move so I can see you. I'm still on mic, aren't I? What's your name?
My name is Nathan.
Nathan. Okay. So Nathan, tell
Yes.
me, what food reminds you of home?
Potatoes. What am I supposed to? Potatoes reminds me of home because it's something I had frequently growing up, and on religious holidays and other special occasions. And whenever I have it, it brings back memories, particularly if they're made a certain way.
So I get the sense that for you, you're pretty sure it was potatoes, reminding you of growing up, particularly if they're made in this certain way for holidays. That
Yes.
brings back.
Yes. On Jewish holidays, it was customary to have a dish such as potato kugel, which is like a potato souffle. So I often associate potatoes, whether it's a kugel or not, with those memories.
And so for you, it was at particular moments, it was the kugel, the souffle type of making potatoes.
Of sharing it with family and friends, and it also reminds me of conversations I would have over that dish. So the memory is much more than the food itself.
And I get a sense that you're quite proud of that, the access that you have to those memories of togetherness and family and a fondness of looking back.
That's correct. Yes, that's accurate. I'm not sure what more to say other than that that's accurate, and I'll have that feeling for a long time.
And so it's not just that you have these kugel potatoes, it's the knowing of it. It's the fact that your identity is able to access with no problem the potatoes, the family, the tradition, the kugel, the souffle, and not so much the food, but the people coming together, which is valuable to you.
Yes, and on a similar note, whenever I have apples and honey, which is a traditional dish at the time of the Jewish New Year, there are some elderly cousins who live here in the Washington area who would have my family over for lunch on the second day of the holiday, and whenever I have apples and honey, I'll think of them long after they're gone. They're in their 90s now.
And so it's the sense that other traditional Jewish dishes, or that especially associated with times of year, second day Jewish New Year, with these elderly cousins, and it's almost as if the food and the ritual of the food is something that you make meaning of. So even though you're eating it now, you know they're not going to be here forever. So you almost have this sort of bigger, the food and the rituals enables you to take a bigger time span and almost see it in the future when they won't be there, and therefore makes it more precious that they still are here.
Indeed, that's accurate. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know. No, I'm happy to continue, but I didn't know how.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Should we give Nathan a round of applause? Thank you. Now, apart from it being totally weird in a kind of bookshop in central DC with everybody watching you, how was that for you, Nathan?
It was wonderful. It really was very positive.
In what way?
It was positive in that, first of all, I was saying things I really believed and really felt, and I just wanted to be clear that it did not feel staged at all to me, because I was saying things that I really believed and really felt, and we were also doing this to demonstrate the power of listening, which is also something I believe in. And I also believe that not that anybody's getting a grade, but I think you did a very good job at listening.
Thank you very much. A quick question. Roughly, how many questions did I ask Nathan? Just roughly. Shout out. 6, 7. I asked him one question. Yeah. Now I was like kind of confused. I'm Jewish, yeah, but kugel, the souffle, I was like wanting to know the recipe. I was confused. I had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask Nathan, but in doing so, I would have taken him down my avenue. I would have taken the steering wheel from him, and as a journalist, I got a lot of questions, yeah? Asked him where I thought I was interested in. If I did that, I wouldn't have given Nathan the opportunity to make sense, the opportunity to go where he wanted to in terms of time and future and all sorts of things. So if I had gone down my avenue, maybe I would have known the recipe and understood the kugel souffle issue, but I would not have understood what Nathan was sharing. And that's why, that's the ambition. And by the way, any responses from the floor? What did I do well? What are people concerned around? How did people feel watching? Do you want to do it in front of a microphone? Come and stand up if you wouldn't mind.
Should I sit here? Or
No,
I...
you're welcome to go and sit down. Thank you,
Okay.
Nathan.
You're welcome.
Thank you. You said you asked one question, and I said 6 because it seemed like when you were affirming what you were understanding him to say sounded like questions because he would say, that's correct. But it's the affirmation that you did really well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I wouldn't quite call it affirmation because I'm not saying that he's right, especially, let's say, if we have a political disagreement. I'm just saying this is my understanding of what you're saying, of the notes between your words and what you're feeling. And I'm hazarding a guess. And I'm offering it to you to reject or to go deeper or to say yes and you will take it where you want to go.
Is there anyone else who had a comment?
It's interesting that you used food as an example. Some people think that having a meal with somebody helps break the ice and get a conversation going and make conversations less contentious. Yet in recent years, people were not looking forward to going home for Thanksgiving because their relatives didn't agree on politics. And I want to know what you're feeling, thoughts about that.
Yeah, both. Yes to both, I mean, food is it immediately changed the dynamic. I remember I had a difficult team when I was at the BBC and I used to go and make bread for them and bring it there because it suddenly broke out of the kind of formal relationship a bit. They probably still thought I was a bad boss, but they did enjoy my bread. So they were a little bit more sympathetic. And people are worried about Thanksgiving. And in a way, I hope this book, more people read it and it gives people the courage to sit with difference and to listen to their family members and to treat them as human beings, even if they have views which they find very, very troubling. And that's my invitation to people to go and try out. I would say with deep listening, try it first where there is no contention. Try it with a family member or somebody you know well, where you haven't got a big, challenging issue. And then you can go on to have more challenging conversations.
I just wanted to say that you got better at the important stuff that he was saying. I mean, the last bit was really, really good and full, and you really reacted to where he had taken it. So that was masterful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it was like weird because I wasn't just. I seriously, when I think of Theodor Reich, who was one of the first pupils of Freud, and he came up with the term the third ear. And if you buy a book and you want to sign it, I will paint you your own third ear, which I like to think of as in the middle of your heart. And it's about using your intuition, just trusting your kind of whole self to meaning make what the other person has said and offering it back with humility because it might be wrong. And that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to think, what's going on here? He's talking about the past. He's talking about these elderly people. They're still alive, but he's imagining they're no longer alive. And that's kind of intriguing, isn't it? He didn't talk about that level of meaning making, but I was sense making and offering it to him as a gift.
You're like constantly trying to draw something out in a way that maybe can feel at a point as a questioner, and I know I felt this as an interviewer before, can feel awkward, where you want to stop because you think, oh, am I just making someone feel uncomfortable? But you end up taking them to a place that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think in a way it's a good question. Like, it feels awkward. I've got 2 chapters in the book on the ethics of deep listening, because people often trust you more, and then you have an obligation to treat what they say with confidence. Or people might share more than you can be ready to bear. If you're a humanitarian worker, for example, people might share stuff, and you can say, whoa, I can see this is really important to you, but I don't feel like I'm the best person. Perhaps there's somebody else who can listen to you here. So, I think it's about your intention to listen to them as a human being, your intention to be open to them. And it's communicating that it's your, underneath your motivation is not about extracting something from them. That, you might be aware of the theologian Martin Buber. And he distinguished between I-it relationships, which is the ones we have most of the time, where we treat the person as an object to extract value from, and I-thou relationships, where we almost like it's our soul listening to their soul. We are attempting to go beyond. And sometimes in a conversation, we will flow between the two. So even you might need to ask a difficult question or need something, but momentarily while you're doing the deep listening, there's almost no agenda.
So how do you approach it from a perspective of time, which is obviously a precious commodity? Do you have to approach every conversation as being essentially open-ended, or how do you deal with that?
We are all juggling a million things in our lives, and we aren't able to, wait around and to have these long conversations. And I was working with some Hollywood execs, and they said, we don't do this deep listening. We need to come out with quick, witty retorts. We don't have silence. It's not us. But I think that while you can't make a single second stretch infinitesimally long, I think it's the quality of our attention. And it's also knowing when it's not the right time to have that conversation. I really want to understand you and deeply listen to you, but perhaps not now because I've got to run in a minute or I'm being distracted. So it's knowing about the conversations that really matter and finding time to have them. Because like if you're the boss and your colleague has got a concern, but you don't want to listen, what happens? It can get much worse. Or they have a brilliant idea and you're not listening to them, particularly if they're the people who traditionally speak up less.
I want to come back to the idea of contentious conversations, because I think in some ways it's like how you deal with your foes, right? And in a moment in which we're living in a very divided society, I know that you were in DC around the time of the inauguration, and you spent some time talking to folks who'd come to town to celebrate President Trump's inauguration. And I'm wondering what you took from that and what you learned from that was revealing, that would perhaps be you felt you were able to extract from those conversations that you hadn't heard.
I was in town. I was doing some deep listening work with the Atlantic Council, thanks to Dickie, who's here. And I thought, I can't just be in DC without taking this opportunity to meet people. And it wasn't hard because, I'm sure for those of you who were in DC at the time, the whole of the city was full of people with Trump regalia and scarves and medallions, and they'd come from Nebraska and everywhere. And I spent kind of 2 days lining up with them outside Capital One Arena, getting no closer to Capital One Arena. We were just lining up in the cold. But I was surprised how open they were for me to ask some questions, and maybe easier because I'm a Brit, so they can't put me in a box, where I live or where I'm from. But I hadn't expected that degree of openness, and I was particularly interested in listening to women. And I did say to them, Trump has said various things about women. As a woman, I'm really interested to understand why you are supporting him in the context of what he has said. And I really tried to make those statements without judgment, to be genuinely curious. And they shared with me, they shared stories. They said to me, it's either fake news or it happened a long time ago or all men are dogs. A number of women told me that. So, that was pretty interesting. And in one case, actually, I was taking the train. I was staying with my friends Avner and Julie. And happy birthday, Avner, by the way, today. And I was taking the train, and I spent half an hour from Chevy Chase to the center of town and had this in-depth conversation with these 2 women. And at the end, it was time to get off. They said, I could see by some of the things that you said that you weren't a Trump supporter, but it really surprised me that you wanted to understand us, that you accepted us as people. That's something we just didn't expect. And in fact, there were a lot of T-shirts for sale saying, "Finally, we have been heard." And there were pictures of all the states that had voted overall for Trump. And I think that sense that, I feel it is so important to understand, we're not talking about the politicians, we're talking about ordinary people who make decisions, who vote for populists, because I believe that if we don't hear people, they are much more likely to be unheard. And that's what Hannah Arendt said, actually, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, much more likely to be sucked up by authoritarian tendencies. And therefore, it is important to society to listen to everyone and to understand them. And more important, almost than that, to enable them to feel heard.
One of the things I really liked about the book is it is packed full of anecdotes. I mean, obviously, you've done, I think, you've done this with work now with thousands of people. You've done it in a ton of different countries. What are the anecdotes that really stand out for you? The stories that really keep you going and really sort of motivate you?
I'll tell you a little story which is actually not in the book because it happened quite recently. And it's just something really small. I was at the pharmacy picking up some drugs for my daughter just round the corner from my house. And there was a lady in a plastic chair waiting for her drugs. And the pharmacist said to me, "So when was your daughter born?" And I said, 3rd of July, 21. And the pharmacist said, "Wait a minute, you sure?" And I said, No, how could I be so stupid? It's the 3rd of July, 2001. Whereupon the lady sitting on the plastic chair waiting said, "Goodness, how could you not know the birth date of your daughter? That's pretty silly." And I said, "Yeah, that is pretty silly." And I had a laugh. And I started talking to this lady. And she told me we started talking about age and having people at different ages. And she talked about her grandmother. And she said, yeah, her grandmother had just celebrated an important milestone birthday in her 90s. And she said, "Yeah, I'm pretty proud of my grandmother." And I replied to her, "I sense that you're really proud, but there's something else going on." And she responded, "Yeah, I think I'm going to die before my grandmother." And then she started to talk a little bit more, and she explained the condition that she had, her medical condition. And then she started crying. And then she apologized for crying. This is Britain, we don't like to express emotions. And we talked some more. And then she went home and I went home. And it was just this sort of moment where I happened to be present. I mean, my husband James is here. He'll tell you I'm often not very good at listening, but I do have moments when I am in the space to listen, yeah? And it happened to be that I was in that space. And probably also the fact that I was willing to be vulnerable and to acknowledge that I was pretty silly about forgetting my daughter's birthday, that allowed her to feel safe enough to share her story. And I had a sense that she hadn't had that opportunity. She needed that opportunity because there's so many people in the world who are so lonely. And all of us, on some level, we're also lonely. We haven't had a chance to be heard. And if more people will listen to those, not only to their family, to their friends, to their colleagues, but also to strangers. Like, imagine the kind of world that we can create. And I don't mean all the time. I mean, I think people also have a right to solitude. It's got to be at a moment that works for you. But if we can do that, it feels that there can be a space of true possibility and true connection.
There was another amazing story, I thought, in the book about the Lebanese teacher in the village that had been where a lot of Syrian refugees had come to stay, and that she had started with feeling very hard-hearted towards these refugees and very bitter about them coming to her village, but completely sort of changed her attitude after sort of engaging in sort of deep listening with the sort of new Syrian community.
Yeah, I mean, it's just been so lovely. And I've been in touch quite a lot with her. She was actually recently on a podcast with the British Council because they tracked her down and had her on the podcast with me, which was really lovely. Because, she grew up in a very traditional Muslim household. And her father, for example, didn't want her to engage with anybody, any woman who wasn't veiled or a woman who unveiled themselves. It was like really challenging for her. And the refugees from Syria who were living in her village, like many people in the village, they were really resentful of these refugees. And it was somehow during that process, engaging with people from across Lebanon, across the many sectarian divides, that kind of changed her mind and enabled her to see the possibility of listening across difference. And so she now not only has become best friends with a carer of her mother who is from Syria, she actually spends Tuesday afternoon teaching at a Syrian school. And her listening has become so great that I use her as an example of really strong listening in the way that she listens to her students and gets some of these Syrian students to really open up about what it's like to live where they have to have a curfew. What's it like to be accused and not feel at home? And for them to share that with her, a Lebanese woman, is really, she knows that's a big deal. And even if she doesn't agree with everything they say, she's really feels, uplifted in her soul to be able to offer them that space to unpack what's going on for them.
So to those of us who are sort of here, how would you suggest we start? Where do you start in terms of if you want to practice deep listening? How would you encourage us to go out into the world, and where is the best place to start investigating?
Well, we could ask everybody to have a really quick go now. What do you think?
Let's do it.
Yeah, do a bit of an experiment. And so you need to find somebody you do not know. And if you haven't found somebody, you put your hand up and then you go up to another person you do not know. And you can ask them just for a few minutes what food reminds you of home. And a bit of guidance. You want to not ask them questions, yeah? Even if you're interested in the recipe of the souffle, whatever it was. No questions, just one question you can ask, actually, if they really clam up, is tell me more. Because tell me more allows them to define what more is rather than you. Yeah? And so no questions, 10 seconds of silence after they finish speaking and see what happens. And, are you guys up for this? Because Americans, you're all kind of social and up for these sorts of things. Is that true? I'm getting, listen, it's not compulsory.
No cultural cliches, please. That's
Hey, you're a fellow sort of American Brit. This is optional. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. But my invitation to you is to have a go and see what happens, because we're all in the process of becoming. You might, and actually the research, brilliant guy at Chicago, Nick Epley, has done a lot of research in the US and even in the UK. If we feel like really uncomfortable talking to a stranger, when we do it, we're likely to find it far better than we thought. And I should say, I've done this like at UN General Assembly, and people are still talking 4 years later. Yeah, and if it can
it's the same conversation. That's very UN General Assembly.
I can see people want to leave at this stage. We're only going to do it just for a few minutes before we wrap up. So stand up, find somebody you don't yet know, and ask them what food reminds them of home. And if you can't find somebody, put your hand up, and then find somebody with their hand up.
Pairing off.
Go ahead.
No. Yeah, would you like to talk to... There's a guy over there.
Yeah, sure, let's do it.
Oh. You can join a three. This gentleman here?
It's... There's a victory. That's it.
I don't feel like anything in particular springs to mind. I don't know. Do you have anything that's like immediate?
I haven't had to do anything. It's just you.
Well, a number of them. Okay. That's better than I.
People actually engage you, which is fun. Yeah. And people are laughing. That's always a good thing.
Very circular, and it's very hot on the sides.
Oh,
It's very common.
it's a very good.
She said and Rice Krispies, and she said, yeah, it's the one part. I said, one part? She said, yeah,
Very common.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So that's why I.
It's like popularity now is Turpin, right? It's like that desire to talk. So if you ever talk to someone who's not in your that mainstream trade.
Yes, exactly. So, do you want to give him another minute?
Another minute. One more minute. Yeah.
It's so nice to see people having. She'll tease you now. I thought it was him. He's a friend of ours from London. We didn't expect him to be here. I mean, he lives in San Francisco.
So we want to pull people together then and just ask people for if they have any references.
Yeah. Shall I do that, or do you want to do that?
You should just do it, and then.
If you tell people to reconvene, and then I can just be able to answer their responses and their questions. We can go a little over.
I don't think that's the problem.
It's quite nice to.
It kind of like there was no interest. It was like I couldn't really. It had a hole in it.
Yeah, exactly. But he's like, he did the formal, okay, enough already. This is my husband, James.
No, I don't know that I did. I don't know that I did.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Would you like to join us for pizza?
Next door.
We're going next door for pizza.
Let me
Yeah, please, you and your
double
wife.
check whether I think
you guys to
we're going to get our. May have to go and get. Let me check with her.
Yeah. No,
I'd love
fun.
to. I'd love
We're
to.
with these
It's,
friends and George, who's doing fascinating work in AI existential threat stuff in
They've
I don't know what he was doing in DC, but I just thought it was him, and I wasn't entirely sure.
That's fine.
And I wasn't sure yet. You want to just check
Okay,
it's okay
yeah.
to go for a minute or two?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. Yeah. Should we just we'll put them back? Oh. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna get. Okay, let's reconvene, folks.
So I'm really interested for those who want to wrap up their conversations. You're welcome to continue afterwards. People want to gather back here, or perhaps, because I want to know what that was like. What was it like listening? What was like talking? And by the way, please don't share your food stories or your deeper stories of your partner, because they're confidential. You can say about your own stuff, but not their stuff. What was that like? What was easy? What was hard? What was weird? What did they try? Something they hadn't done? Julie? Do you want to go? Would you mind? There's a microphone here.
So I was super reluctant to do this because I was like, why is Emily putting us on the spot and making me do something, whatever. But I thought it was so great, and I really enjoyed the consciously stopping and listening, and actually the part about trying to get what people were feeling, what my partner, whose name I don't even know, that Kathy was, the emotion that Kathy was bringing to her story. I just thought that was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Kathy, what was it like being heard by Julie? Would you mind coming up here? Thank you. You can tell the truth, by the way. Don't feel you have to be polite, yeah? Because I'm an out-of-town visitor.
No, it was just nice to feel that, because, there's a lot of good feelings about family gatherings. And I don't worry about if sometimes there's a little contention here or there, but it was very nice, and that's what was coming out. And I enjoyed hearing her as well.
And what about the connection between you? How was that?
I thought it was very good, and you know, I appreciated her sharing the feeling of a particular dish being a family thing, and it just obviously meant so much.
Thank you.
So I appreciated that.
Thank you, Kathy. Any other responses? Anybody else want to share what that was like? You're raising your eyebrows. Does that? You always raise your eyebrows. Okay, go on.
I think that the pause is really drawing your speaker out. We paused for a few moments, and I could tell he was waiting for me to kind of talk, and instead he was talking more. So I got to hear more of the story, more of the feeling and emotion. So I think it was a kind of, am I talking? Wait, no. Okay, now I should talk. And, you know.
Yeah, it takes a bit of practice, that pause stuff. And it does obviously context dependent. And sometimes you might want to tell somebody, I'm practicing pausing a bit, you know, if you want to something's weird. But I would just invite you to play out in the wild with pauses and see what happens. I remember years ago, an old philosopher friend of mine, we used to edit tape, and we would call something like de-umming. So we would look for an interview and we would take out all the ums and put them on the floor. This was years ago when it was old magnetic tape with a razor blade. So you would have a load of ums just around you like snowfall. And he was really concerned about this because he thought that I was propagating the idea that people just spoke in perfect sentences and encouraging them by broadcasting this on the radio. And in fact, people need time to make sense of things. They need time to make sense. We need time to make sense. And a bit of silence. In the book, I paint pictures of 9 different types of silence because there's so many different types. They're so rich. We can have companionable silence. You know, we can have a rich slumber silence. There's so many different types of texture. And as a writer, George Prochnik wrote, silence molds sound. So the type of silence that you surround words with will change what the person is sharing. And there's research which, you know, people used to think that listening was a bit like reading. What you were doing, it was a passive act, and the words were already formulated and wouldn't change the same as if you read a book. And then there was this great piece of research which came out in 2000 by a Canadian psychologist, Janet Baveless, and she showed that good listeners were actually co-creating the narrative. So when people were listened to well, they spoke for longer, and other research also demonstrates this. They talk more deeply about motivations, and they make more sense of what they're saying, rather than if we're distracted, which we are so much of the time.
I think that seems like a pretty good place to end on, actually. Emily, thank you. It's been fascinating talking to you.
I don't know about you, but all this talk of food has made me really hungry. Copies of Emily's book are available at the checkout desk up there. And as you heard her say, if you get one and want it signed, she'll draw for you a 3rd ear. I'm really curious to find out what that... Paint. Okay, yeah. Paint for you a 3rd ear. That should be really interesting. Anyway, please form a line to the right of the table to get your book signed, and our staff would appreciate if you'd fold up your chairs. Thanks again for coming.
And thank you so much for Politics and Prose for hosting, and for Chris Turpin, who stepped in to do such a brilliant job. Thank you, Chris.